Welcome, friends. This is episode 72 in the Faith in a Fresh Vibe podcast on decolonizing and deconstructing Christianity. I am your host, Rohadi. Welcome, everybody. This is season 10 on authors and their new books. This is part 2 of a two-part series with JR Woodward, who authored The Scandal of Leadership, Unmasking the Powers of Domination in the Church. I'm recording on Treaty 7 territory on the northern part of Turtle Island. JR is co-leader of V3. It's a church planning movement. And in part 2 here, we're going to continue right where we left off and discuss some aspects of spiritual formation, archetypes, Satan's fall, imitating Christ, mimetic desire. This podcast, one with JR, and also the next one are two that are deep in theology. For all of you theology nerds out there, all of you leadership development and church leaders, these two with JR are definitely in your wheelhouse. There are problems in the landscape of Christian leadership, and we need to diagnose those problems. JR brings us one of the solutions to help us along the way. So I'm very thankful for JR's work here. It's an iteration of his dissertation. Listen to part 1 to capture the context for this episode. Just a note that for those of you working through your deconstruction journey, this episode does include assumptions around spiritual warfare. Many of us grew up with that language. Some of us have found some abusive language associated with spiritual bypassing and spiritual warfare, whether or not you even believe in that realm of reality. So we make the assumption that there is such a spiritual dimension and roll through the conversation in that posture. Once again, rate this podcast show wherever you are listening and share it widely. Tell your mom and your mom's book club. Without further ado, we'll jump straight in where we left off in part 1 with this part 2 with JR Woodward, who is the forward writer for my book, Thrive, as we unpack the scandal of leadership. I want to circle back and maybe even repeat, because I think this has implications to our formation as Christians. It impacts our view of atonement. It impacts our understanding of the world in the manner that Christ becomes the scapegoat for the mob or for humanity, is unlocking a new set of eyes, a new worldview or awareness. We'll use that word, unlocking a new awareness to find, reorient ourselves to a new imitation.
It's kind of what Gerard would say is like there's really two arc models. Like so we all have model, and we're all a model to somebody. There's really only two arc models. There's Satan and there's Christ. Now for Gerard, he deconstructs Satan. So Satan is this mimetic cycle. He's been a murderer from the beginning. That's his kind of explanation through many different ways. I go into more depths, but I'm trying to keep it just basic here. So for him, that is Satan. Satan has the ability to both be the accuser of the scapegoat, if you will, as well as kind of bring a sense of order and peace afterwards, which is kind of how he keeps his reign and his power. But now, for him, Satan falls when all of this has been kind of uncovered. And so now there's the fall of Satan, but now we're kind of, in a little bit more of a rough space. Though now, you could say the legal system and all that helps, works in a small way to help, prevent us from killing each other outright, and destroying each other. But it still doesn't do the job. Obviously, the law itself is a principality that is fallen in my view as well. So, from a Girardian point of view, the only way any human being can overcome the powers, Satan and any of the powers, is through imitating Christ. And when we imitate Christ, we'll have desires for the Father, like Jesus did. And so I kind of always wondered, like, why did they say Jesus only did what the Father did, only said what the Father said? It's like, feels robotic. Where's the creativity in his humanity? But if mimetic desire is true, the only way Jesus could overcome the powers is to imitate his Father.
Mm-hmm. As you were providing that summary there of Girard's work around his analysis of these literary giants, all the way up into that analysis, all the way up into Jesus, it reads as tragedy. Like I've seen that movie before, or I've read that book before, and this is a tragedy. And then it shifts with Jesus. Okay, take us now into, well, it's a Sunday school answer, because we know the answer at the start, and I would hazard a guess that every church, denomination, seminary, maybe, every tradition in the West would have some notion of, we want to be like Jesus. There's some notion there,
Yep.
Maybe some more than others. I'll use my context in the evangelical world.
Yep.
Easy. Everyone's going to say that. Be more like Jesus. We'll disciple like. And so here's your answer. Be more like Jesus, or imitate Jesus as Jesus imitated the Father.
How does that differ from any other thing?
But it doesn't. But what layers are you peeling back here to help us identify and name what is going on?
Yeah. Well, so, I think it comes down to, what does it mean for us to imitate Jesus, right? Like, so while that's kind of a easy thing to say, I think that's kind of ultimately where we have to go. So by the time I get into like the remedy, I'm kind of doing a Girardian look at the book of Philippians. And the book of Philippians is an interesting book, not that long, so it's easy to read. But chapter 4, you have these two women leaders who have a fallout with each other, right? Paul says, I plead to you, Euodia, and I plead to you, Syntyche, to be of one mind. The same words that he uses in Philippians 2 when he's talking to the whole congregation. There's something happening with them that's shaping the whole congregation, creating a sense of disunity and so forth. And so for me, I make the case that they're in mimetic rivalry with each other. Now, it could be very innocent, meaning like one of them says, I want to be the best leader in all the best ways. Well, the other kind of mimics that desire. They want to be the best leader. They kind of start to get into a rivalry with each other. And then eventually, a crisis in the church kind of is set out. Now, the only way to kind of get out of this envious rivalry with another person is to actually set our eyes on a different model. With Girard, like, we're captive to imitation. We cannot help but imitate. That's part of what it means to be human. In fact, that's his the humanization, like the start of humanity, would start when we can imitate other people's desires. So what does Paul do in his book? I think, like, here he's in jail, like he's blessing those who put him there. He's writing to the Philippians, and it's really a book about models and anti-models. Jesus is the first archetypical model, Philippians 2. Epaphroditus is a good model. Timothy is lifted up as a good model. And then Paul himself also kind of lifts himself as a model. The Judaizers who were, trying to make circumcision like first class, second class people were the anti-model. So this whole book is about models. And so what did Jesus do? It's kind of like, Jesus takes this journey. He's God, but he doesn't consider equality with God something to be, grasped or exploited. Rather, he empties himself. He becomes a human being, not just a human being, but a slave, the lowest of rank. And then it says he becomes obedient even to the point of death. And but what is that? What does all that mean? And is Paul kind of saying Jesus is to be an example for us in this way? That's nicely debated amongst academics. So we talk about imitating Christ, but just not in this way. I think like part of what was happening, like you have to do a little bit of research on, Philippi and so forth as a Roman colony. The number one commodity for Philippi, and which probably not too different from most of our context today, was honor. If you had money, you used it to get honor for you and your household. Honor was the number one thing. Now, in that day, there was elite and non-elite, and then within those multiple different stair steps within that. But there was the chasm between the elite and non-elite. You were elite just by your birth, like what your attributed status was, wherever you happened to be born into. Achieved honor was, much more flexible, and yet that, it would help you move a little bit, but not too much in that society of honor. So today there's a book, I forget the guy who wrote it, called Status Anxiety. Part of the reason why we have status anxiety today is because like we're more about our achieved honor, not our attributed honor. Attributed honor doesn't really matter as much today as achieved honor, and probably achievement is shown in our wealth and so forth. How much money we were able to gain through our experiences and expertise that we developed. And so anyway, there's this whole system of the world on how does we as people, our sense of identity, how do we get a sense of honor? We nobody wants to be dishonorable. And so the world has a whole system developed on how to be honorable. I think Jesus basically said, forget that system. I'm not of that world system. I'm not going to be developing my sense of identity in that way. My sense of identity is actually found in the Father. So even though I'm God, I can take the lowest job. I can wash the disciples' feet, and it doesn't do anything to mess with who I am. You don't find many leaders in that space today. But not only that, it's not just the willingness to do the lowest job, but it's also the willingness to name and unmask the powers that are oppressing other people, because obedience to the Father is also very bold. And so I kind of use Oscar Romero as an example in this. But before I do that, I want to say, like in Paul's own autobiography that he gives in Philippi, he really starts with his attributed honor. I was circumcised on the 8th day. When he's talking to the Judaizers here, I was born of the tribe of Benjamin. And so he's going into the things that he had nothing to do with, but this is just the status he was given in his birth. Then he goes into his achieved. I was a Pharisee of the Pharisees. As with the law, I was faultless. As with the church, I was a persecutor. Like all of this stuff. So every way that he gets sense of identity in his Jewish culture at the time by his misreading of Scripture, because he was actually persecuting Christ, he came to realize in his blindness. He says, all of that is garbage. That's not how I get my sense of identity anymore. I get my sense of identity in knowing Christ, the powers of his resurrection and the fellowship of his suffering. So I think like this Philippians 2 is more of an identity thing. It's more of like, how do you really get honor? The world has a system. Jesus has a different system. And that's this kenotic journey. And I would say like Oscar Romero would be a great person who learned this. He grew up in a fairly poor neighborhood, really early on, wanted to be a priest, trained in Rome, got pulled back as he was doing his PhD work by this bishop due to World War II. Lives his life primarily like as a scribe, like has a fairly conservative view on most things. He had very much honored the Catholic Church that he was a part of, and had a lot of questions about these base communities that were developing, that some of the priests were developing for the poor, by the poor, teaching them, just the realities, economic realities, and so forth. And so he had a little bit of apprehension, although he did know one guy who was a seminary friend of his, Father Grande, who started like 36 of these groups that he knew was doing it in a Christ-honoring way. So then eventually he was pushed back to be a priest in a very similar place as his hometown. And some of the people in his village were killed by the government. And they said, like, hey, you need to confront the president about this. He says, well, I'm not going to do it openly. I know him. I'll send him a private letter. And he did it that way. Well, eventually, the archbishop, the most powerful, religious position in El Salvador, which is mostly a Catholic country, was, going to retire. Most people thought the one right under him would be the one who would become the archbishop. But the oligarchy and the government kind of stepped in, and they requested Oscar Romero to be the archbishop. He was a bishop by this point. And because they thought he would be not a disturbance to their nicely status quo.
They were wrong.
And so he becomes the archbishop, and I think it's like something like 19 days after he becomes archbishop, the government, one of his deep friends, Father Grande, along with a 92-year-old guy and a teenager, get killed. Most people felt like it was assassination by the government, and so he basically decided and publicly said, like, if the government doesn't do a proper investigation on this murder, then I'm not going to go to the next presidential inauguration, which was happening in a couple of months. Now, even his bishops had a problem with this. They said, you're just politicizing this. And he says, since when has this not been political? So
I've heard that.
He was like Oscar Romero. He didn't live where the archbishop usually lived. There was a terminally ill hospital that the nuns had. They built a small room off of the hospital for him. He refused houses and cars. So he refused to exploit his status as the archbishop. So to me, like Oscar Romero, if we look at this Philippians 2, is like, is this really something we can do, even though Paul might have done it and understand it? Like, is this something me as a person in this time could do? Well, here he is. He has his high position. He refused to exploit it for his own advantage in so many different ways. And then he regularly emptied himself in the sense that, like, he got to the point where he realized he may need to make a stand for the poor and the oppressed. And what that meant is that while he still loved the oppressor in this case, he also called for their conversion and had less dealings with them until they, got things right. And so, yeah, I think I do want to kind of share this one little part. Can I pull this up in my book real quick? One of the things he was doing was he started to name and unmask the powers that were happening in El Salvador there. The way he did that is he would have his homily. And because he started to realize, how much the government was killing their own people started to come to him when they had, relatives that were arrested or tortured or killed. And so he had his lawyers in the church go out and investigate whether those things happened or not. And after his homily, every week, he would list the atrocities that were happening in his country. His homilies and all of the, what he was doing there was broadcast by radio to the whole country. We're told that, like, there were more people listening to his message than that were listening to soccer games or football games in that time. You could walk through any village and not miss a word of his sermon because it was coming out of every car window, every window. That's how popular his message was. In some ways, in the way that Jesus was popular because of how he named and unmasked the powers that were at work. So it came to the point where, he realized, like, he can't continue to do this and not probably feel the repercussions of this. So he knew that his life was on the line at some point. That's what I mean by, like, bold. He was humble and obedient, but prophetic and bold. And he knew that this would mean likely his own life. And so even a couple weeks before he was eventually assassinated, he asked his car driver to not drive him because he didn't want him to get killed. Eventually, he's breaking bread at this terminally ill hospital, and that's when assassin bullet kills him, literally as he's breaking bread. The day before this happened, he was his last, homily. All right, so here's kind of what he said. Now, keep in mind, like most of the soldiers that were killing the people were Catholics, right? 70% of the country is Catholic. And he says this, brothers, you who are part of our people, you will kill your very own poor brothers and sisters. Before the human command to kill, the divine command shall prevail. Thou shalt not kill. No soldier is obligated to obey an order contrary to the law of God. No one has to follow an immoral law. It is time for you that you came to your senses and obey your consciences rather than sinful commands. The church, the defenders of the rights of God, the law of God, human rights, and the dignity of each person cannot remain silent in face of such abominations. We want the government to take seriously the fact that the reforms stained with so much blood are worthless. In the name of God and in the name of the suffering people who have suffered so much and whose laments cry out to heaven with greater intensity each day, I implore you, I beg you, I order you in the name of God, stop the oppression. And it was the next day that he was assassinated. But I think I just want to say one more thing, because I think that, Apostle Paul, Oscar Romero, they lived on a different plane in that they did not fear death. And, when Stringfellow talks about death, death is essentially kind of alienation from everything. And you could say death is kind of our non-existence. It's like we have no sense of identity anymore. Like that's kind of what we ultimately fear. You have to have a different place of getting your sense of identity to not fear death anymore. And so a couple weeks before his assassination, he was interviewed by one of the few magazines that wasn't owned by the oligarchy. And this is kind of what he says. He says, I've been frequently threatened with death. I must say that as a Christian, I do not believe in death, but in the resurrection. If they kill me, I will rise again in the people of El Salvador. I am not boasting. I say this with the greatest humility. As a pastor, I am bound by divine commandment to give my life for those whom I love, and that includes all Salvadorians, even those who are going to kill me. If they manage to carry out the threats, I shall be offering my blood for the redemption and resurrection of El Salvador. Martyrdom is a grace from God that I do not believe I have earned, but if God accepts the sacrifice of my life, then may my blood be the seed of liberty and the sign of hope that will soon become a reality. May my death, if it's accepted by God, be for the liberation of my people and as a witness of hope in what is to come. You can tell them, if they succeed in killing me, that I pardon them, and I bless those who may carry out the killing. But I wish they would realize they are only wasting their time. A bishop will die, but the church of God, the people, will never die. That's a person who didn't fear death.
Immediately following your Oscar Romero summaries and tracking his kenotic journey, you roll into practices. And in fact, when we speak of the solutions,
yep,
the rubric, why it is that there's a pervasive endemic problem in leadership development today, you don't give the book isn't a 5-step guide, and here are the 5 systems for us to apply, which I appreciate. You do, however, chart using the Lord's Prayer, the pathway that we can meander. So I'm wondering if we can end now just by touching on the 5 features that you included when it comes to the start of the answer. And this is how you label it. You say this is merely the start of the answer, which is both simple yet difficult. It's the examination or the contextualization the approach to embody communal prayer around that Lord's table. Let's end with just the snapshots of rooted identity, which we've talked about, vocational faithfulness, contrast community, spiritual formation. So this is not merely, well, what's the answer? Well, let's solve, or let's produce I laugh because as if it would be possible, a program of spiritual formation, and we'll make it, and we'll fix it, and that'll be it. No. Spiritual formation, however, is one of the factors, and then kenotic leadership.
Yeah, real quickly, obviously Jesus taught the disciples to pray the Lord's Prayer. So it's something that a practice I engage with and try to think about deeply each time as I kind of pray through it. But I do think that first part, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be thy name, is just to remember, the first thing is we're a child of God. Our sense of status in the world, there's no greater status than that. We don't have to find status in the same way that the world dictates to us. There's something beautiful just about being a beloved child of God. And even Wink kind of talks about how his achievements in life were often done because he wanted to be loved, both by God and by people. And but like Nouwen would say, it's Jesus, before he started his ministry, foundational to his sense of identity, this is the Son in whom I'm well pleased. He didn't have to do anything to kind of earn that merit. He went into the temptations that the powers bring with a sense of identity and being. And by the way, every kind of temptation, the first one starts, if you are the Son of God. They question his identity. The third one, if you are the Son of God, doesn't the scripture say this? It was always kind of questioning his very sense of identity that was already given to him, that he understood and lived into. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth that is in heaven. This is what vocational faithfulness is, seeking first the kingdom of God. What would life look like if God's kingdom were to be more realized in my neighborhood, in my city, in my country? That's what vocational faithfulness is about. We can't say that whatever we happen to do for money, we have a vocation, and that is that the kingdom be real. So, I think you could say Oscar Romero understood that in a very profound and different way, to the point where a lot of people talk about, that moment when Father Grande died is his point of conversion. It wasn't conversion from non-faith to faith. He had a pretty vibrant faith, but it was a more robust faith. And it was because he was more faithful to the kingdom at that time. And he was willing to kind of have the rich and all of those who had the advantage in speaking directly to them and calling them to conversion. Then there's the contrast community, which is kind of give us this daily bread, forgive us our debts as we forgive others. Really, community is about how we handle economics and how we handle when we mess up with each other. Forgiveness and economics are tied into very deeply on what it means to be a different community than what we have. I like to say contrast as opposed to counter, because otherwise you kind of maybe get into this mimetic trap where you're just reacting to what is out there instead of being something distinct and different. And then the spiritual formation, I look at it as, deliver us from evil, or deliver us from the evil one. In other words, spiritual formation, I think, needs to be done attentive to how the powers are at work in our lives and in the world. If it's not done with that, it's probably not as helpful. And that's where, so when I go through the temptations of Jesus in chapter 10, I think, how do we develop a spirituality in light of these archetypical temptations that if we don't face them at the beginning of our ministry, we face them? But how many people have been trained deeply on, by the way, the temptations are not necessarily about the kingdom, but how are we going to see it happen? The devil's like, I'll give you all the kingdom, but you just have to bow down and follow me. Imitate me, imitate my ways, The kingdom is, the kingdom can be something that we proclaim we want to see, but the question is like, are we doing it in the way of Jesus? The temptation is to do it in another way. And then the last one, and the last part of the prayer that is in addition, but I think makes sense. Thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. Amen. I think our greatest temptation is to build our own kingdoms by our own power for our own glory. And the kenotic journey basically reverses that. And we realize, like, when we become nobody, in the sense that I'm not talking about like, hitting ourselves over the head, like psychologically. It's like I don't care how the world system counts status. I might be a nobody in the way the world will merit somebody and nobody. That's what I feel like that's saying. Like, I'm emptying myself of everything, every way that the world tries to mold me into its mold and shape me to get my sense of status and identity. That has nothing to do with how I get my identity. And so now I can wash feet, or I can boldly proclaim to the government or to the oppressors the message that needs to proclaim. And even if I die in the process, I have no fear, because I know who I am and I know what I'm about.
That's a good word. I'm so thankful for that. I was processing, okay, of these 5, how could they be easily skewed or perhaps not easily, but skewed towards a faith formation that would place us in the current conundrums that we face today, of rising Christian nationalism, of a dissociation of the marginalized body. And each one, but especially as you draw into how near you are in your imitation of Christ, it starts to waver as you press against the desire for power or malformed power, the desire for all of these pieces that seem to be important for many contemporary churches, juxtaposed, and it's compelling how it is juxtaposed to the way and person and character and values of Jesus. And it starts to crumble. Yeah. It starts to crumble. The Sunday school answer we went through, and I'm so grateful for your time, over an hour of you unpacking the scandal of leadership, of unmasking powers of domination, and it's Jesus. The Sunday school answer is Jesus. It still is Jesus, yet we've missed this. We've missed the mark in how we live like him. Yeah. And it haunts me in what manner that happens, or the reason why, the rationale is that we do not desire to be like him.
Really, when it comes down to it, like, I think we either as leaders will become a scandal to those we lead, or we're going to take the scandalous way of Christ. Because as we've looked at it, it's this way is a scandal to us. Like, in the same way the cross was a scandal to the Jew, right? It's like, why would I want to do that? Why do I want to be like, why are you telling me to be nobody? Like, it's like, well, it's not to be nobody in the sense of, unimportant. It's like, when you become nobody, God makes you somebody in a very different way that cannot be taken away by anybody.